respectable sins. It kind of makes it sound like there are certain sins that we can perform or that can be part of our life that are somehow acceptable in the eyes of God. Well, we kind of get that backwards if that's sort of our thinking and if that's how it sounds. When we talk about these respectable or reputable sins, what we're talking about are ideas that while they are accepted among men today, they are certainly out of harmony with God's word. And yet at the same time, we find them being routinely practiced. The idea, perhaps, is that they're just simply not big sins. Now, whether we like to think it or not, we have this tendency to kind of rank things in order. This is a big sin, that's a small sin, that one's kind of in the middle, sort of in that gray area, not really sure, sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe bad. We have a tendency to kind of pigeonhole this idea of what sin is. And there are some sins that, while on the surface we know that they are wrong, they are continually practiced. They're continually practiced and they're continually struggled with by humanity. Last week we kind of gave the introduction to the whole series of lessons. And we said basically this when it came to respectable sins. Well, we didn't say that, did we? Okay? Everybody knows what those are, right? You recently heard about a bear attack. You know, we've heard about a bear attack. I don't know, maybe you don't listen to public radio, but there was a bear attack not too long ago. A guy was killed in Denali Park, I think. We hear about sharks all the time, right? We just went through Shark Week. I remember the first time in many, many years our family came down to Florida. It was about the year before we moved here. I came down and visited in Destin, Florida, just after a couple other hurricanes had gone through and hit Pensacola. And it just so happened the week we came was Shark Week. It was Shark Week, and Shark Week was on TV. So here we are. We're watching Shark Week at night, and then we have to go out to the beach during the day. And, it was kind of an exciting moment for us. But anyhow, sharks, we understand what they are. Alligators, we understand those too, right? We understand that, if there's a waterway and it's fresh water, chances are probably fairly decent that, there's going to be an alligator. Most of us are familiar with snakes too. And these are things that we look at and we say, you're going to avoid those. Those things, those are killers. Those are killers. But do you know all of those four combined together constitute only about 7% of deaths that occur over a 10-year period. Let's say from the late 80s to the late 90s. Only 7%. Do you know where the bulk of deaths fell? From the animal kingdom, animals versus men. If you saw it already, then you already know. Bees and wasps. Bees and wasps kill more people, and yet you could probably go home on the average day, and they're there. You can see them outside your house. Now, I don't wake up in the morning, go outside of my house and see, alligators and sharks and bears and rattlesnakes sitting there to welcome me every day. They're not there in abundance. They're not there in abundance. They're not there every day. And when I do see them, it's an unusual thing. I remember one time we were at the Sunshine Day Camp, and the fella out at Weeden Island was giving us the tour. Did I ever tell you guys this story? The fella at Weeden Island was giving us the tour, and the kids are all gathered in this room out there in that big structure they have at Weeden Island. They're telling us all about the animals and all about the things that we're going to see when we go take the tour out in the marsh. And then one of the boys pipes up, and he sees this stuffed rattlesnake. It's an eastern diamondback rattlesnake. I mean, this thing is this thick, and it's coiled all up, and it's stuffed. And the boy asked the question, are we going to see one of those? And the guy says, no. They're nocturnal hunters. You'd only see them at night if you saw them at all. If you saw them at all. So the tour, the guy finishes talking. He says, come on, we're going to get up. We go out the door to head down the trail. And he turns around. And he's talking to us and he's walking backwards. And 6 feet behind him is an eastern diamondback rattlesnake crawling across the trail. We did everything to try to get this guy's attention, and finally, within about maybe 5 feet, he stopped walking. He stopped walking, turned around, and I'm telling you what, you've never seen a person more scared than this guy. This snake had to be at least 8 foot long, and I'm telling you, it was easily as big as that one that was stuffed and on the shelf. Okay? But we understand that's a rarity. We understand it's rare. You and I are not talking about those, quote, bear-like sins, the shark-like sins, the rattlesnake-type sins. Things like, murder. I mean, none of us here, hopefully not, have murdered anybody. Hopefully, there's not an adulterous situation. Hopefully, we don't fall into that category. But because those things are kind of rare, don't you think they're kind of the less dangerous sort of ideas? You and I are talking about the things that live around us each and every day. Each and every day. We're talking about the things that pose more of a threat to us, and though sometimes we don't see it that way. Someone put it this way. Reputable sins are the sins that are not that big a deal, since we have narrowed the way of Jesus down to 3 or 4 sin avoidance, or 3 or 4 step sin avoidance process. In other words, we've defined our Christianity by a certain category of sins. And we sort of pick and choose. You ever heard of the 7 deadly sins and the 7 cardinal virtues? I mean, really? That's it? There are only 7 deadly sins? I mean, the Bible talks about, sin is sin is sin. I mean, I can name a bunch of sins that are probably not going to make that list of 7 deadly sins. I don't know if you knew this, but littering is actually one of the deadly sins now. Kind of a crazy thing, but apparently it is. Apparently it is. But they come up with these lists of things. Well, I think most of us do this sort of mentally. We convince ourselves that, there are these sins that, are big, and as long as I avoid that, as long as I define my Christianity by these 3 or 4 things that I'm called to avoid, then I don't necessarily have to worry about the things that I live in each and every day. Each and every day. It's kind of like living with a gigantic beehive on your front porch, walking by it every day, saying, glad there's no alligators here. Doesn't make much sense. But we do it. We do it. So we have these respectable sins, and today we're going to talk about envy. You ever heard the saying, boy, they were green with envy. They were green with envy. That was an actual belief. In the ancient Greek world, the Greeks believed that envy, which is kind of a product of the heart, which is something that begins on the inside of who you are, would actually produce a physiological response in the bottle. That's a whole other sin. But physically produce a response in the body. And specifically, it would cause the overproduction of bile. The overproduction of bile, which is kind of that greenish, stomachy sort of stuff that we don't want to talk about that. But it caused an overproduction of bile, which they believed would change the actual complexion of the body to a yellowish, greenish type look. Now, later on, many years later, they would find out that, it's probably jaundice or something like that, which is probably indicative of some kind of, liver function problem. But they believed that envy would cause people's complexion to actually change. And while their chemistry and their physiology is probably way, way off, the idea that they had in mind really isn't that far from the truth. That envy, from the inside out, literally changes you. Literally changes who you are. And causes this manifestation of things that will rot you away from the inside. Being green with envy, while not necessarily something that literally happens, is something that does indeed happen on a spiritual level within inside of us. Well, the writer of Proverbs thought so. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 30. A heart at peace gives life to the body. What is the opposite of peace? Proverbs do that. It's great. The proverb writers have this wonderful way of taking one idea and setting it in opposition to another idea. You see the little word but there? That's what it means. A heart at peace. At peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. In other words, when you are not at peace internally, when you have a life that is driven by envy, by looking at the outward appearance of things, other people's success, their fortune, their fame, and so on and so forth. It literally rots you from the inside out. So while the ancient Greeks didn't have it all right, they had part of it right. This idea that it can indeed affect you. But how many people have you ever heard coming forward and saying, I need the prayers of the church because I'm just really struggling with envy? How many people have ever come to you and said to you, I'm really struggling with envy? Or maybe even went a step further and said, I'm really struggling with envy and you're the object of my envy. So I figured maybe you could help me. I want us to go back to the beginning. Just after the first sin. We all understand the first sin, right? You go back to the Garden of Eden, you find Adam and Eve are there, and God has placed certain boundaries in the garden, and they decide to step across those boundaries, and they begin to bear the consequences of having stepped across those boundaries. They're put out of the garden, they're going to have to work, there's going to be pain, specifically in childbirth. There are all sorts of things that are going to change. And then you and I are going to talk about the story that occurs right after that. Right after that. Chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife. And she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Did you ever wonder about that phrase? This is kind of an aside. But did you ever wonder about that phrase, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord? Why would she say that? Well, it was certainly a blessing to have male children. They could help in the fields and so on and so forth. But I think maybe Eve is sort of getting ahead a little bit here. Remember, go back in the text, and God has promised her something. He's promised her something about her seed. Her seed and how that seed is going to become, victorious and overcome this sinful circumstance that they had placed themselves in. Well, maybe Eve thinks that, that's immediately going to happen. Hey, I had a child. It's a man. This is the seed. This is the child that's going to, change everything back kind of to the way it was. Make everything right. Well, Eve had it wrong by a few thousand years. But maybe that's what's happening. But either way, the thing I want you to see is that they're struggling with sin. They're struggling with the idea of sin and what to do about it and when it's going to go away and how can they have this restored relationship with God. But then the text goes on. And again, she bore his brother, Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of the sheep and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord, an offering of the Lord. I'll get it out in a second. An offering of fruit of the ground. And Abel brought of the first fruit of his flock, of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. And Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. And we're going to just kind of stop reading there and go back and kind of draw out some points. And the phrase that I really want you to look at is found up in verse 4. Because it's the phrase, I think, that kind of gives us the key to what is actually going on here. Let me ask you something. When it says in the text, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? In other words, maybe to ask it in a little different way, what was the difference between them? What was the difference between them, and why was it? Why was it that we see this distinction that ends up causing this one brother to kill another brother? Now, there are all sorts of possibilities that have been prescribed, so to speak, for this situation. But to make it as simple as possible, the text doesn't tell us exactly why. It does give us the words. It does say that he regarded his offering, and then he did not regard the other's offering. You know, it's interesting. If you go through the Bible and you look at that phrase in other contexts, it's very, very interesting. Take that phrase and run it through the Bible and see what you come up with. Let me give you a few examples. Okay? Some versions use he had favor, and that's why it's that way on the board. I'm reading from the English Standard, so it's just a little bit different. If you go over to the book of Ruth, Ruth chapter 2, verses 10 through 13, it's the place where we're told about Ruth going into the field, and there's a guy by the name of Boaz. Everybody remember him? There's a guy by the name of Boaz, and Boaz looks on Ruth and finds favor in her, or she finds favor in his sight. And then you remember what happens next? The thing that happens next is the important part. Boaz begins to take care of her. Boaz becomes Ruth's greatest blessing. Ruth's greatest blessing. They got the corner of the fields, and then pretty soon he's telling some people, leave behind some, for Ruth, to make sure that she's taken care of. And lo and behold, by the time we get to the end of the story, Boaz and Ruth are married. Boaz and Ruth are married. Go forward in your Bible just a little bit to 1 Samuel. Okay, you got 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 22. David. During the time in which Saul had that evil spirit from the Lord, you remember that? That dark spirit, so to speak, that people kind of struggle with and wrestle with. What's that all about? David is called in to soothe Saul. And he plays for him. And it says that David found favor in the eyes of King Saul. And what does he do? He brings David in pretty much full time to do that very thing. And, he went from the field, taking care of the sheep, killing the lion and the bear and all of that, to now living in the palace with the king. So again, just like with Ruth, David here is blessed because he found favor in the eyes of God. Go to Genesis chapter 39 and verse 4. Verse 4, and Joseph's life is literally full of this idea. He's cast in a pit, he's sold, he ends up in Egypt, and then he finds his way to the house of a guy by the name of Potiphar. He finds favor in Potiphar's eyes and is blessed pretty much by being able to rule the entire house, but he's set up for a crime he doesn't commit. He end up thrown back in jail, and then this verse tells us that those people who were over him in jail found favor in his sight. In other words, they were blessing him. The bad things that sometimes happen to other prisoners weren't going to happen to Joseph. They weren't going to happen to Joseph. And you go forward in the Bible over and over and over. Daniel is a great book to look at this too. People find the eyes of God is equivalent to the idea of people being blessed by God. So we have two brothers here in the beginning, and they're bringing an offering. Now, sometimes we say, well, the difference was the type of offering. One gave grain, one gave meat. One made animal sacrifice, one got sacrificed in the field. I don't know. You can go through the Bible and you can find that both were acceptable in the eyes of God. I mean, God required sacrifices of grain as well as he did sacrifices of animals and their blood. And we have no writing of the patriarchal law, so that's just kind of guesswork as to what's going on. I think sometimes maybe the answer is more obvious than that. We look at the sacrifices being made. We look at the sacrifices being made, and it says he had regard. He had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Could very simply be the idea that Abel was blessed through his offering. Cain is not. It may have nothing to do with the offering. It may very simply have to do with a principle that we do well to remember. Not all people, even among God's children, are blessed the same. Not all of us are blessed equally. How many people watch the Olympics? You have to raise your hand, I guess, but we watch the Olympics. Some people are blessed in certain ways, whereas other people are not. Some people are blessed swimmers, right? Some people are blessed swimmers. I'm not a Michael Phelps. I swim. I like to swim. But I'm not going to swim like that guy. Some people are blessed runners, right? Other people are not. Some people are blessed badminton players. Actually, who cares? But the Olympics kind of bring this point out. We're not all blessed the same. We're not all blessed the same. God obviously regards sacrifices differently. And that's his prerogative because he's the creator of all things. But you see, Cain doesn't like that idea. Hey, I'm out here laboring in the field. I'm out here producing the crops. I'm out here setting aside the best, and I'm bringing them to you. This is my skill. This is what I do. Different people receive different blessings. And different people are regarded in a different way, and I would hope that we wouldn't want it any other way. Because by the time we get to the New Testament, it equates to ideas that Paul talks about when he says things like, we are one body, but many members. And we all work together. And we produce this body that is greater than the sum of its parts, called the church. Well, Paul basically comes out and tells us that you're not going to be blessed the same way your neighbor is. You're not going to be blessed the same way that, that other person is. But you see, here's the thing. You can't take those different blessings and allow envy to creep in. Cain looks at Abel and he says, you know what? He does things differently. Why not me? Why am I not getting the greater blessing? I think that's why when we get down here to Cain's response, it's almost as if God is surprised. It's almost as if he's shocked. Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? In my mind, the question is probably more akin to this. You were blessed too. Your blessing was different, and you may see his as more, but you have no right to be angry. Why would you be angry? And why has your countenance fallen? You see, we find favor with God, or God finds favor with us, and he blesses all of us. But we're not all blessed in the same way. Envy enters in, because we're not all blessed the same way. And envy lies to us. And maybe you're not aware of this, but your own heart lies to you. Because that's where envy comes from. Oh, Cain can blame Abel all he wants to. Cain could have blamed God all he wanted to. He could have blamed the father or the mother or any of those other people, but envy comes from inside. It is a product of who you are. When Cain saw Abel's blessings, he should have said something kind of like this. Man, it's cool that God is really blessing you like this way, and I can't wait to see what God's going to do with you and your work in the future. I'm happy for you. But he didn't. God tells him that, look, sin is crouching at your door. It's up to you to resist it. It's up to you to fight against it. Where's that fight going to take place? Right here. Because you are going to lie to yourself. You are going to blame other people. You are going to have these feelings, and these feelings, if they're not dealt with, are going to cause all kinds of disruptions in your life. There are essentially three lies that I want to talk about this morning that envy tells us. Number one, what I need most is what someone else has. Okay? Now, I doubt very seriously that most of us would verbalize that. But have you ever felt that way? I mean, you ever felt that way, that, what I need most is what someone else has? Drive through that nice neighborhood. It's worse, if you live on the other side of that nice neighborhood and your work is on the other side, and every day you got to drive through there and you see these people, right? And you wonder, why them? Why am I not blessed like that? Why don't I have that, kind of, money? Why don't I have that, kind of car? Why don't I have this? And maybe it's not the riches that get you. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's another person's relationship that you're envious of. How come I can't have that kind of relationship? Whatever it is. What I need most is what someone else has. Turn over to the book of Psalms. Psalm 73. Psalm 73. And we're just going to kind of begin reading at verse 1. Verse 1. It says, truly God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they have no pangs about death. Their bodies are fat and sleek, and they are not in trouble. And by the way, that's not a negative thing. In ancient, Hebrew poetry, that would have been considered a blessing, right? They are not in trouble as others are. They are not stricken like the rest of mankind. Therefore, pride is their necklace. Violence covers them as a garment. Their eyes swell out through fatness. Their hearts overflow with follies. They scoff and they speak with malice. Loftily, they threaten oppression. They set their mouths against the heavens, and their tongue struts through the earth. Therefore, his people turn back to them and find no fault in them. And he goes on for a few more verses about why he was envious. It seems like they got it made. Man, they have everything. They've got the reputation. They've got the wealth. People like them. People talk about them. They're the subject of conversation. They're known for their intellectual property and how smart they are and how good they are and how fast they are and how wealthy they are. Now, there used to be a saying, keeping up with the Joneses. It actually refers to a family called the Joneses in the 19th century in New York. And you can look the story up and kind of read it for yourself. But they like to display their wealth. So people kind of began comparing themselves to the Joneses. Well, they've got this. Well, maybe we should have that. Maybe our modern version of that is keeping up with the Kardashians. Any fans? We got a special prayer room for you in the back. What I need most is what someone else has. I want you to notice the end of what the psalmist says, though. Verse 16, he says, "But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task. When I went into the sanctuary of God, then I discerned their end. Truly you set them in slippery places. You make them fall to ruin. How they are destroyed in a moment, swept away utterly by terrors." And you know what this equates to? What this equates to is finally the writer of the psalm is seeing through the lie. Seeing through the lie. What I need most is what someone else has. You are not going to be happy in this life no matter what you have, who you're with, where you are, unless that happiness comes from here. Your happiness begins with you and the choices that you make. And we're going to talk about some of those choices at the end of the lesson. But we want to go on to the second lie. Second lie that envy tells us. Once I have it, it should be I, notice it, my envy won't hurt anymore. See, envy is that thing that kind of drives us to want to get more of what other people have. But we say to ourselves, once I have it, then, that feeling is going to go away and I'll be satisfied. I'll be satisfied, with what I have. And then that lie leads to kind of another lie that's really the main point that I want to get to. Not only will it not hurt you anymore, but envy is kind of a victimless crime, we tell ourselves. It won't hurt me, but it certainly won't hurt other people, right? Wrong. We get envy into our lives. And it begins to rot away at us. And envy in our heart turns to lust for the things of other people. And that lust turns into something else. Maybe anger that other people have of things. And then that anger turns into resentment. and bitterness. And that resentment and that bitterness, when it's left to kind of stew there in its own festering, gangrenous juices, produces things like what we see in Genesis chapter 4. And Cain rose up and slew his brother. Now, maybe you're never going to pick up whatever he picked up and hit somebody with it. There's plenty of ways to slay people without actually slaying the physical body, isn't there? Go over to the book of John. Go over to the writings of the New Testament. And speaking kind or unkind words, not loving your brother, becomes equivalent to the idea of murder in the New Testament. If we say we love God and yet we don't love our brother, then we are a liar. And we're guilty of sin. We're guilty of sin. You can envy your brother and let it lead you to the point where that rottenness inside begins to bleed out. You see it happen in the workplace at times, where there's division. You know, this group here doesn't like the boss. One of the things that you typically find at the center of all of that chatter, all of that venomous hatred that goes on behind the scenes. Sometimes even the reason why people go in and take stuff from their work is envy. How come I can't be the boss? How come I can't be the one giving the commands? How come I can't have this salary? Or how come I don't have this parking spot? And people get really, really weird over some things like that. But it's not true that it goes away and doesn't hurt you and that it's a victimless crime. I mean, you think about it for a minute. You go back in your Bible and look at all of the places where we find envy. You're going to find families breaking down. You're going to find people losing relationships. You're going to find difficulty and hardship and heartache and heartbreak. I like the way C.S. Lewis put it. He said, we say people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they're not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than others. When it comes to envy, there's always another in the conversation. And the same is true with the hurt. The hurt doesn't just stay here. The hurt extends out to the people sometimes that we envy, and sometimes there's just simply collateral damage because we envy another person. Victimless sin? Well, it's not true. Go back in Scripture again. As soon as that pops up. Envy produces bitterness, gossips, grudges, failures to forgive, lack of compassion, backstabbing, even murder. Isaac envied Esau. How'd that turn out? Rachel envied Leah. How did that turn out? Joseph's brothers envied him. How'd that envy turn out for them? Look at that entire family and the defining quality in all of the hardship and all of the pain and all of the murderous plots that go on. Envy's at the heart of it. Third lie. God's primary job is to glorify me. Go back to chapter 4 and verse 6 of Genesis. Chapter 4 and verse 6. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry and why is your face falling? As soon as the envy comes in, Cain kind of turns inward. There's no doubt after reading the entire context, and you can go and you can read even the remote context, that Cain here is consumed with himself. Well, how come you didn't lift me up? How come I'm not lifted up as much as him? God's primary job is to glorify me. You got to wonder how many times that folks kind of have this mentality when they come to worship, or they consider the church as an idea in general. The church is there to help me. The church is there to provide this for me, or to provide that for me, or to give me opportunity. rather than you're there to add to the body and make it stronger. It's funny, if you go over to the book of Matthew, let's turn there very quickly. In the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 20, Christ is telling the story, and you probably remember the story. It's about workers, and it's about different workers being brought in at different times, and then getting paid the same thing. He goes in the morning and he agrees with workers. They come in and this is what you're going to get paid, 1 denarius. He goes out at the midday, and then he goes out later in the day, and then when they all get paid, some complain. And some people begin to complain, hey, wait a minute, how come they're getting, the same as us when they only worked an hour? They were only there an hour. What you first have to realize is this isn't new. This is Cain and Abel stuff. All the way back at the beginning. But I want you to notice verse 14. Matthew chapter 20, verse 14. He says, take what belongs to you and go. This is the response to the question. Why did they get the same? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to the last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do that? Do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? Do you begrudge my generosity? You see that little word begrudge there? Some of your versions probably say different things. Different things. The ESV uses begrudge. In the original language, it's the word ophthalmos. Does that sound familiar? Anybody ever go to an ophthalmologist? About your eyes? About your eyes? That's the primary usage of the word. It means eye. It means eye. But the same word is also translated as envy. Envy. That's kind of interesting, right? We talk about eyes that are full of envy. Well, that's literal. That's literal. Because the same word for eye is the same word for envy in the Greek language. So what he says here is, do you envy my generosity? Are you envious of these people over here? Shouldn't you be happy that I'm a generous guy? Especially when it came to you. I gave you an amount. You agreed to work for it. God's job is not to glorify you. It's your job to glorify Him. And we ought to be happy and thankful for the blessings that we've been given and use them for God's glorification. Not envy others. Very quickly, there's a way for us to get at it. God tells him that sin lies at the door, but it's for you to overcome. In other words, God says you can overcome it. You can overcome it. And here are some things that I think we just need to be aware of, and I'll give them to you very, very quickly. Number one, we need to root out comparison in our lives. Someone once said it this way. He said, you need to stop comparing your insides to other people's outsides. Stop comparing your insides to other people's outsides. You think about that for a little bit. We need to stop comparing ourselves all around. God made you as a unique creature with a unique ministry and unique talents. And He expects you to use them to glorify Him. Not compare them to other people so you can feel slighted or you can feel better. I don't know. I think we've all met those kind of people who they don't feel good about themselves until they put someone else down. It's the same kind of thing. Number two, we can be a brother or a neighbor. That's Cain's response. Am I my brother's keeper? You know, it's funny that if God actually answered that question, which isn't in the text, God would have said, yeah, you are. But see, you've missed the boat, Cain. You missed the first and greatest command. That it's about me. It's about your Creator and you serving Him. But then you missed the second one too. It's about your neighbor. It's about putting them before you. You are your brother's keeper. And we're called today to not do any less, right? We're to be our brother's keeper. And when I say that, what I mean is very simply this. When you find somebody who's being blessed, maybe with things, especially with things that you're not blessed with. It may be uncomfortable for you at first, but go up to that person and congratulate them. Tell them, hey, God has richly blessed you. I'm glad to see it, and I can't wait to see how God is going to work in this through your life. For some, that might take a little gritting of the teeth, but everything takes time to get used to. We need to be our brother's keepers. And then third, if it'll come up, place your hope in Him alone. Place your hope in Him alone. I mean, what are you hoping to gain by gaining other people's stuff? Did not Paul say it best when he said, naked I came into this world, and naked I'll leave it. I'm going to the place from whence I came, and none of the stuff is going with me. None of the things I envy are going with me. Give ourselves fully to God rather than fully to the things of this world, and we won't have any problem with envy. It's a difficult thing to overcome. It's a hardship, no doubt, that comes to our lives at various times. And most people, I think, kind of suffer from this at some point with some button that can be pushed. And I would hope that we, when it comes, are readily there to respond with the things that we've encouraged today. But none of it means really anything unless we're giving ourselves fully to Him. And that's the question we leave you with today. Have you? Have you been washed clean of those sins? Are you living in the pathways of Christ? Have you heard His word and believed, repented of your sins, confessed that Christ is the Son of the living God, entered into the waters of baptism so you can rise to walk in newness of life and walk in that path? If you're here and you need to do that, or if you simply need to return to walking in the right paths, we encourage you as together we stand and sing.